Thank you very much, and sorry about the technical problem. So, yes, I'll talk to you about linguistically motivated trend identification. So we did neologism detection for German and English, as it turns out. And we also used a word embedding system, topic modeling. So, what is the motivation? Why did we do this research? It is a fairly well-known and common approach to use to count how frequent certain keywords exist, and then typically the attention that is given to political issues correlates to how often they are mentioned in the media. This works very well. We're also doing that ourselves, but there are two slight problems with it. On the one hand, language itself actually changes over time, and that's why we look at how new terms are introduced. These new terms are typically multi-word terms, so several items we detect their invention, their fixation, and sources. Often new terms also come with a new stance, with a new perspective on topic. Often these new stances indeed have a new tonality, a new sentiment with them. They want to influence perhaps the reader in a certain way. That's why we use sentiment detection. Secondly, of course, the mapping from word to topic, from word to concept is not one-to-one. Therefore, we have also used word embedding systems. What is a neologism? So first we turn to German. It's a new term, but not an ad hoc created occasionalism. So if something is only used once, or only one source, or only for a week, then it does not really meet the criteria. So neologisms, as we see, the criteria should be new, but they should occur repeatedly and across multiple sources. And we have used several filters in order to then get candidate lists which are relatively good. Of course, in German, one major way to create new words is actually by using noun compounds. So Fußball plus Europameisterschaft gives you Fußball-Europameisterschaft. There are very few limits. So how do we detect new terms? Of course, we could search for when they occur for the first time, but for that one would need enormous resources, and of course, most words have already been used before we even started to write things down. But with the filters that I have mentioned, we actually get reasonable candidate lists. This is just a very short view of our pipeline, which of course at the end, at bottom right, also has a manual selection part. When we apply this to our input sources, which were mainly the three major Swiss newspapers for the German application, NZZ, Tagi, Blick, then looking at different sources, so these articles which have something to do with the Swiss party landscape, for example, there we get neologisms such as Heiratsstrafe, Scheininvalide, Superreich und Weißgeldstrategie, or in campaigns, so for voting, it was Politgeograf, erste Stopp, Klima vorbeipolitisieren. We also looked at articles about climate change, Klimaabkommen, Klimaschutzmaßnahme, Klimasünde, etc. You see on the right the translations into English if you need them. And we also looked at articles about Invalidenversicherung, so about disability regulations. We had Scheininvalide, for example, Integrationsmaßnahmen, Frauenrentenalter, and so on. When we look at where these neologisms are used, we can look at the probability. So these are traditional probabilities. So if we have the word Scheininvalide, then there's an 88% chance that SVP will occur in the same article. These columns don't add up to one because often in articles we have several parties that are mentioned. Heiratsstrafe seems to be a CVP, Christian Democratic Party word. The Liberal Democrats are interested in Weißgeldstrategie. Super rich is, of course, a social democratic party interest to avoid that, and so on. So, of course, these are expected results, but it is also good to see one's expectations confirmed. So, we've seen, summing up interim, this is a simple but quite efficient approach. Our criteria seem to work fairly well, and we can also apply them to subsamples of the corpus, so as we have seen when we take only articles dealing with, say, climate change or with invalidity. We're going to zoom in on one particular case now, namely Scheininvalide, which we saw was an SVP word. And here we have the article where it appeared for the very first time, because the author didn't Scheininvalide before, and it often happens that when a new word is coined, that in the beginning it appears with inverted quotes before it then makes a career. And this word, of course, did have a career, so it was used and adapted. And now we can check what it's supposed to convey. What is the sentiment that this word is supposed to transport? And of course, has a stance and probably a negative stance. So we try to measure this. How can we do this? If we look at all articles which mention IV or Invalidenversicherung, then we compare the overall tonality by sentiment detection system and those where particularly Scheininvalid is found in addition. We're using a state-of-the-art sentiment detection system, which was also developed by us. It's a targeted sentiment detection system, but at the end, for what we're showing here, we're actually often summing across the entire document again. So here, for example, we see those articles which contain Scheininvalid, that's the left bar. Indeed, negativity is much higher than those which do not contain Scheininvalid, and positivity equally goes back a lot when Scheininvalid is mentioned. Okay, so we have a strong negativity, but where does this negativity exactly come from? What is it correlated to? Again, a very simple approach. We look at which other words are most likely to occur. And we see that generally, so articles not containing Scheininvalid but which are negative have the most important word problem in it, which is not surprising. So things are challenging, costs, deficit, so it's very often financial restraints. Whereas the documents containing Scheininvalid have misuse, Missbrauch as the most important correlated words. So we have indeed seen, as we have expected, that negativity increases. And the stance, the words that correlate with this negativity are quite different. Now we switch to English. In English, we also create new words, but the situation is a bit different because these are typically two words which are, well, multiword terms. So, for example, compound nouns are actually spelled in two words. And they are also, like in German, a major source for creating neologisms. Here we have one example: education system versus system of education. System of education is, of course, the same, but the expanded form. And we see, and that's really quite interesting, language is changing. Education system, which was invented in about 1880, then for a long time was the minority form, but in about 1970 it took over and is now by far the more frequent word. Of course, you can't do this with every verb, with every noun prepositional phrase combination, unlike in German. It's much more restricted. In particular, in English, it's a relatively frequent phenomenon. When we look at, we used the data-driven approach on historical corpus, the so-called Archer corpus, text from 1600 to 2000. And we looked at how often noun-noun sequences are, and where we have a noun-noun sequence, we'd also check whether this is licensed by a long expanded form. So if we have x, y, do we have y of x, or y with x, or y on x, somewhere in the same corpus. We also manually evaluated it. That's the red bar. So you see there's an enormous increase in noun-noun combinations. So perhaps noun-noun combinations are important. They create new words. Here we just have one example of a noun-noun combination which has made quite a career. Climate change, of course, it has increased a lot. Here we see one of those peaks. Actually, after 2007, it went down a little bit. Again, it's a word which has been around for a very long time, but in the early occurrences, we actually find sentences like, a climate change would do you good. Of course, here they mean something is different. In the present day texts, we don't find that meaning anymore there of climate change. Then it would be a change of climate would help you to refocus or things like that. So we have really a fixation, a fossilization, and as always in linguistics, if something becomes a new lexical item, this also means that semantically it narrows down. And that's actually interesting about noun-noun compounds. They're very narrow semantically. We're now looking at yes, climate change, and we want to look at its associations and its contexts. For this, we look at the New York Times corpus, which is available from 1987 to 2007. It's distributed. And we want to look at which other noun-noun combinations are overused in its context. And when we do that, so we use O over E, which is known from collocation measures, or T-score, another collocation measure. Here we measure overuse. And that tells us that, for example, carbon dioxide is overused in this area, or climate change, or energy efficiency, and so on. And we wanted to know, is there a difference in how this word is used? Has the debate on climate change actually changed over time? So what you see on the left, carbon dioxide, is actually something which was very important in the early stages, before 2000, and climate change later, after 2000. Then I also built semantic classes, like solution frames, that would be things which help, so energy efficiency or fuel economy, who's to blame, what are the culprits, energy use in power plants, of course, political action, so climate treaty, energy policy. There's the scientific voice, which you can see in research groups and in climate research. There are other environmental issues, such as ozone layer and drinking water. There's also criticism, such as the greenhouse theory. Should we believe this at all? This is the actual system output. We see that, for example, carbon dioxide was the most overused in the early period, while so here it is, carbon dioxide was the most overused in the early period, followed by greenhouse effect and so on. Then in the late period we have climate change, vice president. Tomorrow night is perhaps a false positive, but we also see things like energy bill, so can we afford this? And of course, when we then semantically classify these, so these long lists as such are perhaps not immediately obvious, but when we classify it, then we see that the core concept has become much less important. Culprits are perhaps mentioned a bit more often. Science is more important. Other environmental issues are not mentioned anymore, but also criticism has actually increased a lot. And not criticism that people don't believe it, but mainly criticism like energy bill and energy crisis. Can we afford to do what we have to do? I talked about nouns, which is, of course, a multi-word expression, which is very important, and also people from information people can say that they offer multi-word expressions of a better unit of analysis than tokens. They are used a lot, and I believe that noun compounds are actually particularly interesting because they're very technical terms. They have a very stable and a very narrow definition, and also one which typically doesn't change very much over time. Just to give you an illustration of that, if we look at terms which are generally important in the early and in the late period in the climate change debate. Here I've used the logistic regression and document classification approach, which actually these approaches did work extremely well. They allowed us in this case to classify over 90% of the documents correctly into the early period versus the late period. But most of these features don't actually look very interesting. So page or no idea, 1990, yes, of course, that is more important than. The few which are important, like greenhouse effect, are actually noun terms. So what happens if you use noun terms only? Here we get automaker, greenhouse effect, greenhouse warming, ozone depletion, and so on. At the early, or climate science, environment minister, cell research, warming gas, and so on. Here, most of them are actually really very interesting terms for the climate debate. Although classification is a bit lower, only 83%, the features that we get like this are actually much more interesting. So it's not only also document classification. On the one hand, you need features which work well, but often they turn out to be not very interesting features, but they actually have very interesting and useful features. Coming to the question of the mapping words to concept, we also used a word embedding approach, in this case latent Dirichlet allocation. When we got 5 topics, so the top one, climate, warming, global change, so that's a very generic topic, saying something like that, change is looming. The first one, topic number 1, that's the second row, Mr. People York book, this seems to be an everyday topic, very, very unspecific. The second one, years, water, ice, species, scientist, this seems to be quite a scientific topic. The third one is about carbon emissions, and the fourth one finally is just about administration matters, Mr. Bush, President Administration, and so on. We can then check how these topics develop over time. There's a good bit of fluctuation, and surprisingly, there are not very many trends. The main trend that we see is topic number 1, the daily matters. They really increase a lot. So climate change has arrived in our daily lives and actually has an impact on our daily lives. The voice of science fluctuates a good bit. The carbon emissions perhaps also increasing a little bit. You can also take more than 5 topics. Here we took 100. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can, for example, see in detail when Hurricane Storm Katrina and when that happened. You can also, Kyoto Protocol, find out when that took place and so on. What I showed here, I did that on just all nouns. You can also do it on the noun-noun combinations. We get similar results. We can't tell yet whether they're better, but that's one of the things that we wanted to do. So we conclude, we have detected neologisms in German and English. We have used news text corpora and also general corpora, and of course what I showed to you is only an excerpt of all the things that we did. We look at the influence of neologisms on the public. We stress that noun compounds are particularly interesting. We will pursue these ideas, also looking at syntactical n-grams. And of course, we want to continue to target the sentiment. So not only about what something is said, but also who is actually the source of expressing a certain stance or utterance. And I think that was what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.
Yes, please. This is a general trend to shorten expressions. I mean, climate change is shorter than change of time.
Absolutely, yes. There's even, in linguistics, there's a law called Jesperson's law, which says that everything gets more and more fixed over time. And people do no longer analyze the individual components. So this is actually the concept of lexicalization A good example is the Latin, well, and then at some stage, if it gets too short, you need to start adding things again in order to make it clear. So the Latin word hodie, which means today, by the late period was shortened into something like what, and people didn't understand it anymore, and then they asked, pardon, and then au jour de moi, aujourd'hui, and like this it was clear. So yes, that's the law of linguistics.
More questions?
Maybe technical question on how you assign the vocabulary to the LDA classes that you obtain. Because you obtain 5 classes, and then how you assign the name of the class.
Okay, the latent derivative allocation is an approach which is totally data-driven. So it finds classes. Well, we heard a little bit about in the talk by Martin Jecki, but he didn't say very much. So basically, well, it's known that if you have certain classes, then documents belong to that with a certain probability. Because you have the probability of a class given a document. And at the same time, words in certain topics are much more likely to appear. So you have a probability of a word given a class. And in LDA, you try to optimize both at the same time. So I repeat, P class given the document and P word given the class. And of course, the documents and the words are there. They are given. And the classes are adapted in order to make the probabilities that you actually get what you get as high as possible. It's completely data-driven. It's extremely elegant. But of course, you need relatively much data. LDA is just one method, and of course others which are based on neural network are increasingly also coming. But these methods, yes, actually work surprisingly well, and I recommend everyone to experiment with them.
More questions? The last one from my side. When we talk about trends, we're usually curious about the future. What can we learn from this for the future?
Right. Well, we can learn for the future that some terms make a career and others don't. But of course, once they have been around for a brief moment, then we can actually detect them. Be that with the education system at about 1880, and also in the 1990s with the climate change that was there. So I think we could also think about hashtags. The noun compounds are a bit like hashtags. They create new concepts which then can be taken up by the community. Of course, it's very hard to predict those new concepts, those new noun combinations, for example, which have started to exist. Which of them make a career?
Have you also found compounds that have been artificially created by interest groups or by companies or governments?
Well, I think the one that we have shown with the parties, I think that one is especially a good example for what you mentioned. And that was also one of the main reasons why we did this study at all, is because we knew that that is called strategic communication. It's one important part of the strategy of the parties, to inject those new terms into the public discourse, also to somehow influence the public discourse and making some aspects more salient and omitting other aspects of a certain political issue. And therefore we just did this with this starting idea that we especially focus on these new terms injected by the parties.
Okay. Last question. Is it difficult to filter out named people, because people would come and rise and become very popular?
Right.
Barack Obama.
Basically, it is, well, we use named entity recognition, of course. And it's also, I mean, people are also very important. Well, also as one already says in Latin, vita brevis ars longa, so people come and disappear at very short notice. But yes, named entity.
This also depends if you, I mean, if you want to couple it with topic modeling, something like that, to see which context or how contexts change. So there's always a decision, should I omit the names of the people, the persons, the locations, whatever, or should I include them? Because there are also cases you're interested in what kind of network is emerging and how is it coupled with that team or that context and so on. So that depends on the case, what you're interested in. But just filtering them out of the candidates list is not that a problem, since named entity recognition is quite efficient.
But for attribution, which is the next step, they are of course extremely important. The value of the database of who was which party speaker or MP at a certain time and so on, and that helps us.
Okay, thank you very much again, Gerold Schneider, like guest Michi.
Yes.
Amsler, who just joined.